Well, we all love to see amazing things, don't we? When I was a kid, there were TV shows dedicated to the concept. They had names like That's Incredible, Ripley's Believe It or Not. It was a whole hour of just amazing things. Now, granted, some things were more amazing than others. And even today, what do we watch? We pull up YouTube, we watch trick shots, we watch crazy things happen to people all over the world, or even our TV shows now. We watch home makeover shows, we watch cooking shows. We want to see someone do something incredible. Like, who doesn't want to watch a chef make a world-class entree out of hot dogs, instant pudding, and a bag of craisins? I mean, it's crazy. And I think watching people do incredible things is one of the reasons so many of us love sports. Those moments that happen during a sporting event where someone does something almost superhuman. Some of us stayed up late last night to watch that happen. Those moments, they're frozen in our mind. Who could forget the 2016 Olympics? Usain Bolt was so much faster than these guys that he had time to look back at them and grin. These are the fastest runners in the world. I don't know if his 9.58 and the 100 meters is ever going to be broken. Or how about this guy? Let me try that again. How about this guy? Alex Honnold. Have y'all watched this documentary called Free Solo? I sat on the couch and watched him for 2 hours, and at the end of it, I was exhausted. Y'all, this guy climbed a 3,000-foot sheer rock wall called El Capitan. For reference, that's 2 Sears towers on top of each other. Climbing experts called what he did unthinkable. He climbed that thing with no ropes and no safety gear by himself. It's incredible. But as incredible as these achievements are, there's one that stands out above them all. One athletic accomplishment that whether you were alive to actually witness it or not, it's probably burned in your mind. Let's just relive it together right now. For those of you who don't know, we call that simply the shot. Scotty Thurman, 1994, shot clock running down, seals our national championship win against Duke. We can never watch that too many times. But as amazing as all those things are, and they are amazing, none of them can compare with the story that Cassie read for us just a few minutes ago. Because only one time in human history has someone walked on the surface of the water, and that's what we're going to take a closer look at this morning as we continue our series on the miracles in the book of John. Well, my name's Michael. I get to serve on the community team here at Fellowship Fayetteville. And Cassie, I really appreciate you being willing to read that for us. Those of you who don't know, Cassie Booth and her husband Ben, they're longtime community group leaders. Ben leads a men's group. They were instrumental in helping Finley Robinson get Merge, our ministry for seriously dating and engaged couples, started. So Cassie and Ben, thank you for your leadership and loving people well in the name of Jesus around here for a long time. Well, let's turn to the passage she read. It's in John chapter 6. It's the same chapter that we were in last week. Last week, Brian Pope did an incredible job walking us through the first miracle in the chapter, the feeding of the 5,000. And as Brian pointed out, John is really focusing our attention here on who Jesus is. And we keep pointing to this week after week, but let's remember the purpose statement of the book of John. It's in John 20, 30, and 31. John says, Jesus did a lot of other things, but these miracles, these signs, they're recorded so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. It means the Messiah, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So with that in mind, let's look at John chapter 6. We're going to pick it up in verse 16. It says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. So we have some important details to set the scene here. First of all, it was evening. So the sun's going down. And they walked down to the sea, and they got in a boat, and they headed toward Capernaum, which is on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, anytime we study a passage in the Bible, we need to remind ourselves what comes immediately before and immediately after that passage. And what comes before this, we remember from last week. It's verse 15. It says, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountains by himself. Now, this is an important transition verse because it tells us why Jesus wanted to leave the crowds. They were wanting to make him king. And I think it also explains why Jesus put the disciples in the boat and sent them off. One of the things Brian reminded us of last week is that there are 4 gospel accounts. 4 different men, each inspired by the Holy Spirit, wrote 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. And each one of those men had different things they emphasized, different themes they highlighted, and different details they either included or omitted. And this story from John 6, it actually has 2 parallel accounts. Mark and Matthew both tell this same story. Mark in chapter 6, Matthew chapter 14. And in those passages, there's this real sense of urgency as Jesus sends them away. Matthew says it this way: immediately, Jesus made the disciples get in the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. That word that's translated made there, it's actually the word commanded. There's this sense that he's pushing them into the boat. He's getting them out of there. And I think John 6:15 tells us why. The last thing Jesus wanted was for these disciples to get caught up in this let's make him king moment. So here they are. They have to leave. And of course, the reason the crowd wanted to make him king was he's just fed them all. The feeding of the 5,000 has just happened. So Jesus has already done this incredible miracle. And the disciples have not only witnessed it, they've participated in it. They were the ones handing out the bread and the fish. And so now here I am imagining the disciples getting into the boat and thinking, we're gonna make this quick trip across this corner of this sea. It's really just a big lake. And they're thinking, this is gonna be an easy trip. We've made it hundreds of times. We're gonna get to a comfortable bed. We're gonna eat some leftover miracle bread. It's gonna be a nice evening. But as you heard in the passage, that's not what's gonna happen. Going back to John, verse 18, it says, the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Now, when you think about the Sea of Galilee, it's in northern Israel, and it's only about 50 miles inland from the Mediterranean. So it's relatively close to a major body of water. And it's really low. It's down in what we call the Jordan Rift. The Sea of Galilee is actually 700 feet below sea level. In fact, it's the lowest freshwater lake in the world. And so weather can move in quickly off the Mediterranean and drop down into that valley in a hurry. If you've ever been out on your bass boat, when the weather starts to change, it can happen quick. A few years ago, my family was on vacation. We were at Virginia Beach, so that's on the Atlantic. And we could see some storm clouds out on the horizon, but we weren't too worried. And then everybody around us started packing up their stuff. And we're like, oh, our hotel's only like 200 yards away. We'll stay out here a little bit longer. Well, what we didn't realize is, and what they all knew, in front of the clouds and rain that you can see is the wind. And pretty soon, my family was getting absolutely sandblasted. I think we still have some beach gear, Lee, that's got sand from that day in it. And by the time we gathered up and sprinted that 200 yards to the hotel, that weather was there, and that rain was lashing that building. The weather can move fast on the water, and I think something like that is what happened to the disciples. They started off on what should have been an easy trip, and it turned into a grind. Again, the other Gospels fill in some detail here. Matthew says the boat was still a long way from the land, and he says it was beaten by the waves. And the word Matthew uses for beaten is usually translated tormented. This little boat is getting beat up. And remember, this is not a big ship. These fishing boats they used on the Sea of Galilee, they were about 25 feet long, 7 or 8 feet wide, about 4 feet deep. This little boat is getting tossed around on this wind and waves. And Matthew also tells us what time it was. He says, by now it was the fourth watch of the night, which is a Roman way of reckoning time that means it was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So let's think about this for a second. What time's evening? Well, let's conservatively say 6 o'clock. Let's say they got in the boat at 6 o'clock. It could have been earlier, and then let's go on the early side of the fourth watch. That's 3 a.m. Even conservatively speaking, that means they had been fighting the elements for 9 hours. A trip that should have taken 2 hours max. They've been at it all night. So much for the comfy bed and the hot meal. Now they're out here in the middle of the lake, fighting for their lives. And that's when the story takes this amazing turn. Verse 19. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Okay, let's put ourselves in the moment with them if we can. Imagine you're a disciple. You've seen an amazing miracle. We've walked up and down all these people all afternoon, passing out bread and fish. Then Jesus has handed us an empty basket, and we've picked up broken pieces and leftovers that's filled the basket. Then Jesus has hurried us into the boat, sent us out onto the lake, and now we've been fighting this storm for 9 hours. We're trying to make these last 2 miles, and we just can't get there. And through the darkness, across the waves, with the wind blowing sideways, we see this figure moving toward us. I'm imagining the lightning flashing and illuminating the surface of the sea, and we see something. Of course, we're going to be scared. Now, in Matthew and Mark, it says the disciples said, "It's a ghost." And when we read that, we're like, a ghost? Come on, disciples. Have you ever seen your water hose and thought it was a snake? Of course. We've all had that moment where we jump back and then we're like, oh no, I actually put that there. I don't know why it scared me. And when you think about it, it would have been irrational for them to say, oh, that's probably Jesus walking on the water. These guys were exhausted. They were fearing for their lives. They're caught in terrible conditions. I think we should cut them a break. I think we would have been terrified too. But it's not a ghost. It's their leader, their rabbi, their teacher, Jesus. And he's not coming to them in another boat. He is walking on the surface of the water. Let's not let familiarity with this story rob us of the amazement. Everybody's familiar with the story. People who are non-believers use the phrase walks on water, right? Usually we use it if we're thinking about somebody that we think is overly revered. Like maybe an SEC football coach at another school. And we would say, oh, those people down there think he walks on water. We're saying it sarcastically because he doesn't walk on water. Nobody walks on water. But Jesus did. Okay, put yourself back in the boat. The fatigue, the terror, the conditions, lightning flashes. You see, it's the face of the man you've been following, your teacher, the miracle worker. And he's walking across the surface of the churning sea, and he says to you, "It is I, do not be afraid." Now let's take just a moment and think about what the Bible actually says about fear. We've all heard, the Bible tells us over and over, don't be afraid. But the Bible doesn't tell us there's nothing to be afraid of. Actually, when we read the Bible, it's pretty clear there's a lot of things to be afraid of, including this storm that the disciples in. But the reason the Bible always tells us not to be afraid is because it gives us the antidote to that fear. Over and over, we're told, don't be afraid because the Lord is with you. In the Old Testament, the people of Israel are repeatedly told, don't be afraid. Yahweh, the creator God, the covenant-keeping God of Israel is with you. And now here's Jesus, walking on the surface of the raging sea to be with his men, and he says, it is I. Do not be afraid. What do you think he means in that moment? I think, first of all, he means, don't be afraid, I'm not a ghost. It's me, your friend. But I think in a bigger sense, he means, you don't need to be afraid of this storm that's all around you because I'm here with you and my presence is enough. And when we look a little more closely at the Greek, we see something really interesting in the first part of this verse. It is I is a perfectly good and reasonable translation. But in the original Greek, it's ego eimi, which means simply, I am. Jesus walks out onto the water in Matthew, Mark, and John and says, I am. Remember the burning bush? Moses said to God, who should I say sent me? And God says, you tell them that I am has sent you. We usually transliterate that Hebrew I am into our English word, Yahweh. Jesus walks on the water through the storm and proclaims boldly, I am. Now you might be thinking, didn't we just do a 7-week study on the I am statements in John? I don't remember this being one of those. And you're right, it's not considered one of those. But man, I sure feel like it's setting up the first one, which comes later in this same chapter when Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And when we pull all of chapter 6 together, here's what we see. Just as Yahweh fed the children of Israel with miraculous bread from heaven when they were in the desert, Jesus feeds the crowd with miraculous bread in the desert place. Just as Yahweh splits the Red Sea so the Israelites can walk right through, Jesus shows his command over the waters by walking on the surface. And just as God told Moses, don't be afraid, the great I am is with you, Jesus walks out on the water and says, don't be afraid, I am. Man, I feel like in our Bibles, this is a great big flashing neon sign that John has given us that says, Jesus is Yahweh made flesh. He's saying things and doing things that only Yahweh, the God of Israel, can do. Which brings up a question. Why then did Jesus send them into this storm? As I mentioned earlier, Jesus put them in the boat. He commanded them to go out there. They were being obedient. Why did Jesus do it? Did he know the storm was coming? Yes, of course he did. So why did he put them in harm's way? Why did he put them in a situation where they would work for 9 hours to the point of exhaustion? Why did he put them in a situation where they would be terrified and their life would be in danger? I think it was so he could reveal himself to them in a really powerful way. Oh, they had already seen Jesus do some amazing things. But it's clear from Scripture they were still struggling to understand who Jesus was. And Jesus knew they would never forget the moment where they saw him walking on the surface of the water and proclaiming to them, I am, so don't be afraid. And here's how the story ends in John. They were glad to take him into the boat. And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. I bet they were glad to see him. And then they were at their destination, just like that. What the disciples had struggled to do in their own power unsuccessfully for 9 hours, Jesus accomplishes in a moment. Matthew adds that they worshiped him. They understood that he was more than a man, more than a prophet. They worshiped him as the Son of God. And we see it in John as well. The next day, after this experience, Jesus looks at the disciples as others are abandoning him and says, do you want to go too? And Peter says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we know and have believed that you are the Holy One of God. What brought Peter to that moment where he could make such a statement, such a confession that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God? I think it was what happened the night before on that lake. And so let's make a couple of big observations about who Jesus is based on this passage. Number one, Jesus is God over the storm. In the Old Testament, the sea is often depicted as a place of danger and chaos. Think about Genesis 1. Before God forms anything, it says, darkness was over the face of the deep. It's a place of mystery and danger. And even today, if you go out in deep water and you kind of look down into it, it'll send a shiver up your spine. How far down does it go? What's under there? It seems dangerously unknowable. But throughout the Old Testament, God is depicted as one who's not only over the sea, he controls it. God doesn't fear the oceans. He's the master of them. Psalm 107 is a great example. Psalm 107 is full of things that only God can do. Only God can bring a lost people out of the desert. Only God can free a prisoner from their shackles. Only God can fill the bellies of the hungry. We've seen that in John chapter 6, haven't we? And then look at verse 23. This is Psalm 107. Some went down to the sea in ships doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, all caps, it means Yahweh, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. Then they cried to the Lord, to Yahweh in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Who is it that delivers people on the sea from their distress? The Lord, Yahweh. Who makes the storm be still? The Lord, Yahweh. Notice verse 30. They were glad and they reached their destination. Remember what verse 21 in John 6 said? They were glad to take him at the boat, and immediately they were at their destination. Who's the God over the storm? Yahweh. Who can walk on the water and rescue his men who are in distress and deliver them safely? Yahweh made flesh. And his name is Jesus. Jesus is God over the storm. It's incredible. But he's not just God over the storm. Look at it with me again. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. The disciples are in this terrifying storm. And where is Jesus? He's right there with them. In fact, it seems like he's walked 3 or 4 miles across the water to be with them so he can say to them, don't be afraid, I am, and my presence is enough. And so that's our second big observation. Jesus meets us in the storm. When there's chaos all around us, where's Jesus? He's right there with us in the storm. Jesus stepped out of heaven where there's no chaos and there's no storms and stepped into the chaos that is life on this fallen planet. And then the very last thing he says in the book of Matthew is, I will be with you always. And so we never have to wonder. We never need to ask, where is Jesus? He's with us. He will walk out onto the water in the middle of the storm and remind us, I am. Jesus is God over the storm, and Jesus meets us in the storm. And that's what's so unique and amazing about the incarnation. about who Jesus is. He's fully God, the creator, the sustainer of all things. He's sovereign. The wind and the waves obey him. Nothing catches Jesus off guard. Nothing surprises him. There's no storm he doesn't know coming, and there's no storm he fears because he's over them. But he's also the God-man. He's fully man. He's experienced everything we experience, yet without sin. He's the God who is over the storm and the God-man who's with us in the storm. And so to go back to what Jimmy was saying at the very beginning of the service, whatever storm you're facing, wherever there's chaos in your life, in your work, in your relationships, in your health, there's nothing there that surprises him because Jesus is God over the storm. Nothing overpowers him. Nothing's a mystery to him. He's above it. But he's also in it. He's in it with you. He's not some distant God who's unknowable. He's right there, and he wants to be in relationship with you. He wants to reveal himself to you, even in the midst of the chaos, even when things are hard, even in the middle of a terrifying storm. He's there. He's with you. The great I am who split the water so his people could walk right through is the same God who walks beside you in the middle of the storm. He's over the storm, and he meets us in the storm, and his name is Jesus.